The environment has always been the sort of spindly, weak pillar of sustainable development that's always almost an afterthought. Not all the time, but quite often is. And we're seeing a shift now to bring that right to the front. And smart organizations and smart developers and housing associations will be doing that proactively rather than getting their fingers burnt during the next few years and then having to learn from their mistakes.
Hey, how are you?
Yeah, very well, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, not too bad, thank you. Thank you so much for joining. Yeah, I'm excited for this one. Just before we kind of dive into it, I think it's probably best to start off with a little introduction as to who you are, what you do, and why.
Yeah, so I'm Jack Potter. I'm the Biodiversity Manager at Ground Control. Yeah, so I mean, a lot of my work is obviously focused around biodiversity and tackling the biodiversity crisis that we're in, effectively working with clients to realise their opportunities and manage risks.
So tell us a little bit more about the biodiversity crisis that we're in.
I mean, I think that Britain is embarrassingly in the sort of bottom 10% of countries worldwide for biodiversity loss. So we are in crisis, and I think what little remains of our environment is absolutely critical that we hold on to it for dear life, and try and expand on what we currently have and reconnect to add more resilience to our landscape.
What sort of percentages do we have left in respect to like biodiversity within the UK?
Well, I mean, that's a really difficult question to ask, and there's been lots of studies and modelling done to answer that. But it depends what you call the starting point. To be honest, do you call the starting point, when robust records began, or before that? Because we've been having an impact on this planet and this country for quite a long time. So yeah, where that baseline sits is critical to actually how much has been lost. But I think ultimately, comparing whichever baseline you use, comparing to other countries, we're at the bottom of the pile at the moment.
What's it been mapped out over the course of maybe the last 2 decades? Because that's probably an easier area to look into, and kind of what are the driving factors behind kind of the loss that we're witnessing?
I mean, we've been in a nosedive for some time. I'd say probably the last, I don't know, maybe 100 years, that nosedive maybe started. And there has been some modelling done on actually where the tipping point is for environmental collapse, and in Britain we are right at the very edge of that threshold. So it's quite a worrying time to be in, and it's easy to point the finger, and I think a lot of the finger is ended up being pointed at the agricultural industry, which is I guess they are the custodians of our environment as the owners of land where wildlife generally lives. But that has been driven largely by government and policy and incentives to do various things over the last century. So there's been a lot of reasons for it, and I think the change in culture now, and the I guess it's on the radar of everyone. The general public care, and that really is what drives government and politicians to care, because that's their constituents on who they represent. So that's why we're starting to see things like the Environment Act and the need for biodiversity net gain in the development sector, but also more globally looking at there's something called the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, which is a bit of a mouthful, but that's a really exciting thing that's happening globally, which will effectively mobilize finance in the non-development sector to start recognizing their own impacts on the environment. So it's a really exciting time to be in, but without dwelling on the past, it's a pretty depressing place to be in as well.
Yeah, for sure. But talking about the task force, walk through the realities of that. Who does it involve? What you're trying to achieve, like the wider goals that you're looking towards doing, and kind of the key driving factors behind it.
So Ground Control are a forum member of the task force. There was a task force for climate-related financial disclosures, which was set up some years ago, and that really drove what we see today in terms of the carbon market, and why companies are putting a lot of emphasis and time and money into making their impact less on the world in terms of carbon. And this task force for nature-related financial disclosures is intensely more complicated. Nature is a complicated system. It's an ecosystem that relies on multiple moving parts. Carbon is quite simple to be able to quantify. Nature's not so much. So ground control represent and work with a variety of clients, some of which are in the development sector, where they have a direct impact and loss of particular habitats, and balancing the books through metrics to be able to put back in the environment what more than what was lost. It is something which is fairly easy to do. But when you're looking at non-development organizations where potentially, I don't know, a drinks company where they're having an impact by abstracting water from potentially a water deprived area with water quality issues, what is that impact on the environment, and how do you quantify that? How do you add resilience to that company? So there's lots of things to consider in this space, and I'm sure things will become more clear over the next few years. And there's lots of pilots going on within the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosures. I was on a sort of pilot forum meeting at the beginning of this week where there was a few case studies run through, and it's an ever-moving and evolving space, but it's an exciting space to be in.
I remember there's 2 points that I kind of just want to jump into. I remember not too long ago when COP took place, I'm pretty sure that for the 4th time in a row, biodiversity was kind of postponed in respect to the challenges that they were looking at. And also we saw that is in respect to some of the deadlines that were being placed in respect to net zero. I remember like Modi pushing his deadlines out again for another 10 years. Where are we in respect to like leadership on the overarching issues that we're facing, such as climate change, biodiversity, and what should our leaders and what could we as individuals be doing to address some of these challenges that we they're simply there. They're a reality of the world that we live in, but ultimately we want to get towards solutions rather than continuous perpetual crises.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of the government's ambitions and where we're placed globally, I'd say we're actually fairly forward thinking on this. Having the Environment Act, which mandates legal requirement to leave the environment and nature specifically to be in a better state than when you started, is a step change to what we've previously seen. And never before has an ecologist like myself been given a blank canvas of an arable farmer's fields and just been told, do something good for the environment and it will be paid for by the development sector. So that is, incredible, and it's an incredible step forwards. And it values those sort of mundane, I guess, urban sprawl habitats like pony paddocks, which previously have never had any recognition in the planning process. So I think we are quite forward thinking holistically, and the biodiversity metric, which is what's used to measure biodiversity impacts in the development sector, was actually derived from Australia. So Australia were also fairly forward thinking, and I think there are a lot of other countries which are following suit. So
I saw they brought into law recently that around, did they not say that by 2050 they would be brought into law to have net zero? And also they put a deadline in around 2030, 2043 as well in respect to what they're trying to achieve. So yeah, I think Australia, like, they're kind of doing amazing things. It's just ultimately like, what do we take from them? I agree, definitely the mandates, because one of the things, I guess one of the challenges that we see in the UK, there's a lot of push towards, for example, affordable housing. And if people are developing, then, the requirement in my view to like mandate a percentage of biodiversity net gain as part of the plans would be quite an interesting thing to do. I don't know whether they're doing it or not, but like, what are your views in respect to how we approach development in this country?
I think from my experience in the development sector, all that's needed is certainty and the availability of a solution. They're the two things that are needed. And if it can be put into a spreadsheet to factor into the costs and the viability, and that solution is available and it's affordable, then as long as everyone's on the same page and everyone's at the same starting point, that's all that matters. So I don't think it's necessarily a blocker to development. I think on the social housing side of things, ground control does do a lot of work with housing associations. And I think they are potentially struggling to see a light at the end of the tunnel. So we're currently working with them on how they manage their existing estate and realize the benefits they can sort of lever out of their existing land holdings, but also manage risk in terms of new acquisitions. So, if, for example, certain habitats are present on site, which means that it's going to be X pounds per dwelling, that tips over the edge of what's affordable for them. So I guess there's a shift that we're seeing over the last few years, which is sustainable development is meant to be, the 3 pillars of sustainable development. And the environment has always been the sort of spindly, weak pillar of sustainable development that's always almost an afterthought. Not all the time, but quite often is. And we're seeing a shift now to bring that right to the front. And smart organizations and smart developers and housing associations will be doing that proactively rather than getting their fingers burnt during the next few years and then having to learn from their mistakes.
Yeah, I think it's, I was reading a book a little while ago called Long Path by Ari Wallach, and it talks about how we've got to become the ancestors our future descendants need. And it's very much about the long journey. The journey that we take is long, and it can be turbulent, but it requires long-term thinking rather than kind of the strival towards shortcuts. Yeah, I think that's where we are at the moment. Like, it seems to me like the understanding is, like, as an industry, like, biodiversity is still fairly within its infancy within the UK.
Yeah, it is. And I think it was 2012 that the first DEFRA offsetting metric was released and had a lot of criticism because, it was seen as, I guess, undermining the mitigation hierarchy where, it's sort of straight to offsetting rather than trying to minimize the impacts and do things on site. But yeah, there's been an evolution since then of the metrics. And I mean, I came from Natural England, and I was in the specialist team, effectively building the metric that we see today, and I'm a key author on the guidance. And I am biased because I've been part of that process. But I think the metric that we have today is scary to people for seeing it for the first time. But it's very thought out. It's evidence based. It puts a value on all habitats, which has never really been considered before. And it gives an opportunity for wildlife and green spaces to be integrated into our built environment, which after a pandemic, everyone is valuing so much more to be able to have access to that green space. So it's a really important part of levering that out of development.
I think it's also interesting when we look at, you mentioned the pandemic, but then subsequent, we're having like cost of living crisis at the moment. People are like, being quite cautious with their money at the moment. Like, how challenging do you believe it will be, and kind of what solutions can ground control provide in respect to like big businesses living up to their commitments and also supporting like people at the bottom end of the scale in respect to their own like day-to-day living?
I would say that nature and the environment is actually more important now than ever. We know, evidence tells us that nature and access to the environment is absolutely critical to well-being and mental health. So, yeah, although we are looking at a crisis financially and the cost of living and all those things, but access to nature generally should be, and currently is, free. It would be not. I think we've come a long way to date in terms of trying to integrate these things into the built environment and giving people that access. And there's lots of, I've done studies previously for local authorities which sort of maps out people's access to nature and identifying where there's areas of deprivation and where that needs to be improved. So there's a lot of movement towards identifying this, and I think it would be great to see in the future how, although the NHS is clearly stretched for money and funding, actually having funding specifically for people and well-being and mental health where it's needed, to then tie those two things together, because there's a lot of talk around it, there's a lot of evidence to support it, and I think that just needs to be realised and mobilised.
Yeah, I agree 100%, because if you kind of look at what happened with respect to pandemic, Like, not only do people have to go through insane levels of grief and loss that we all kind of shared during that period, equally, we, when we do go into periods of isolation, there's also that the rise or the epidemic of isolation that comes off the back end of it that is kind of well documented in respect to people's own mental health journeys. And then there's a rise in opioid addictions, and there's very obvious indicators that there's a need there to support people at its primary source. And yeah, I do agree that there's always been that argument, right, between how the NHS was funded and the element of like social care on the side. And yeah, like, to me, it would make more sense to kind of separate it and have it as clear funnels for investment into people and also into planet and also into services and infrastructure. But I don't know, like, hopefully we'll get to that point. But I think it at this point in time, it does seem like it requires a little more finessing and more education from like the likes of you guys to policymakers to ensure that they are looking more towards people, planet, and the long term rather than kind of just short termism. And I think in respect to that, I would like to understand a little bit more into kind of, if you were given a blank sheet, for example, what would be like the top 5 things that you would be advocating for at this point in time? And second to that, I'd like to kind of explore a little bit more in respect to things like carbon credits.
I'm fairly radical in my thinking, and I think the government's not ambitious enough. Yeah. And I appreciate there needs to be a line to be taken which satisfies all. And we're looking at potentially the latest scheme, which is called ELMS, Environmental Land Management, and that's just been proposed to be scrapped, which is a huge step backwards to go back to the generic payments not really requiring anything of landowners, whereas ELMS is sort of paying for environmental goods for people in communities. So yeah, I mean, a more focused environmental stewardship scheme type approach, which at the moment I think it always has been really slightly ad hoc. So who wants a stewardship agreement? There isn't enough resource to be able to target people in the right places, and there should be. So more money for being able to target people. There should be more money available for those stewardship agreements, and potentially less of them to be able to pay more to have it in the right place. Because all of the evidence has said to us so far is that we need bigger environmental spaces for nature, and they need to be more connected. And you're not going to achieve that by having ad hoc agreements scattered or peppered across the whole of the landscape. You're juggling too many balls to achieve the objective, which is unreasonable to achieve. So I think for me, it's more targeted. And the Environment Act is one way of identifying actually how we do that or where we do that, because there's something called the local nature recovery strategies, which Ground Control are actually part of in a number of the local nature partnerships across England, where basically you're mapping out where the current assets are that are most important to protect and enhance, how permeable the landscape is around them and between them, which then identifies where actually habitat creation would be most valuable. Now that mapping exercise is amazing. That's really going to allow us to focus on where it matters, where we need to implement change and focus our finance from whatever sector that is, whether it's private or public funds, to be able to achieve the bigger, better, and more joined up picture. So I think that's one thing that I think, I feel like is a priority.
It does sound a lot like, and we do see, we've got to be like fairly straight with the facts. We do see that at the moment it's a bit of a crisis in confidence rather than anything else, because the decision making is always kind of, almost like reactive rather than proactive in respect to long-term focus. It's understanding as well, if that mapping thing would be useful, amazing, in fact, because you'd be able to like see fairly clearly areas of the country where you could kind of build, and also other areas where you should nurture and maintain. If you have that kind of partnership approach in respect to, actually, we want to see progression, but we want to see it in a sustainable way that's for the benefit of all, then, we have real opportunity ahead of us at the moment, and we can kind of move beyond some of these kind of turbulent effects that we see at the moment. if we start thinking more towards long term. And I think that's the cool part about where we are at the moment. Like, it does draw, I did mention about carbon credits, and I do want to kind of come back to that, because the idea of carbon credits and how they are being utilized by business, and also the work that you guys do, and also kind of the approach, because carbon credits are one thing, but kind of we can go above and beyond that. So if you'd like to kind of walk through, to people that don't know what carbon credits are, how they're being utilized, and also what options are available to us to go beyond them.
Yeah, I mean, I won't pretend that I'm a climate and carbon expert. I'm a biodiversity expert, but nevertheless, we do, at Ground Control, we do try and sort of harness all of the different ecosystem services and credit systems that can be monetized to drive landscape change, which is focused around what's best for the environment and for people in that environment. So I guess my main interest around carbon credits is around the nature-based solutions rather than the renewable energy side of things, or prevention of cutting down a woodland to then claim the credits that are within that woodland type thing. And we've recently embarked on a journey a few years ago where Ground Control basically put aside 5% of their net profits into a fund, which was then invested into environmental schemes and startups. And there was an opportunity to buy some land locally to the headquarters for Ground Control, which is in Essex. So that farm was bought. It was a almost entirely arable farm with a bit of woodland. And then I think the intention was basically for a woodland scheme. But then on sort of further reflection and sort of insights into the markets available and what needed to be achieved on the site, which was best for the environment and the local communities, there needed to be a joint approach. So basically the landscape plan for the site was to have a swathe of woodland of about 50 hectares of woodland creation through the Woodland Grant Scheme, which is a government grant scheme, which would then generate, I think it's 18,000 tons of carbon over 50 years. So they're the credits available, which I think is intended for Ground Control to use them internally. And the Woodland Grant itself effectively paid for the actual capital cost of doing the woodland creation. So there's no profits available for sort of doing the implementation of it, but the carbon credits could be then claimed by Ground Control. And the rest of the scheme, which is probably just over half of the site, was then put towards biodiversity net gain, and effectively having a mixture and a mosaic of scrub, grassland, woodland, and ponds, all of which interfacing with each other and in a sort of, I guess, crazed, slightly unorganized environment will create what's called ecotones between each of those habitats, which are known to be best for the environment. So you have sort of species that live within woodlands and species that live within grassland, and then you have the ones that live in the interface between the two. So you're sort of maximizing the biodiversity value and output for that.
I think it's interesting as well, because listening to you speak, I immediately harker back to some of the previous conversations we've had on this podcast. And one of the ones that immediately springs to mind was a business called Gratitude that work within the computer game sphere. And they essentially take a percentage of an in-game purchase from an online game and utilize that for, sustainable means. They've got work and partnerships created with the likes of Shark Trust. They also give 10% of their annual revenue away. And looking at the scope of the games industry, for example, they've got, by 2027, the games industry is set to generate 337 billion in revenue. They've got 3 billion active players. All those 3 billion active players have the opportunity to utilize some of the credit that they use from an in-game purchase through Gratitude to go into a partnership with the likes of yourself, which I think that one is the easiest win to do, and just say, well, actually, they're doing amazing work here. You guys are doing amazing work there, and just connect the dots. Because I think that there is going to be a bit of a challenge, right? Because if you look at the way that even budgets from a government perspective are kind of put together and created, historically, back in the day, there was a lot more local ownership. So in respect to that, the local nuance, in respect to where, you could invest those funds and why. Nowadays, the budgets are being cut, and we've got to be kind of real about this. So the budgets are being cut, and it's also being like everything's being centralized. So there's less opportunity for that, regional approach that could be adopted. However, if you move above and beyond government and look more towards a partnership approach in business, there's real opportunity to be created and a real wealth of experience to be utilized to implement things that are going to be of lasting impact to people and planet. And I think that for me, it's wonderful to hear the work that you guys are doing, because it really encourages me for what is about to take place in the next evolution of society as a whole. And I think where we're going, it's all for the positive. So yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you. So thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Purpose Made podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to Purpose Made wherever you normally get your podcasts to hear the latest news and views. You can also find and follow us on Instagram, LinkedIn and Twitter, or contact Peter directly to connect, inquire about Purpose Made, or request to be featured on the podcast. We look forward to welcoming you back soon for another episode.